Let me welcome you to this, I think, historic panel just prior to the election. I'm Bob Fitrakis. I'm the Executive Director of the Columbus Institute for Contemporary Journalism, which not only publishes books. This is our latest on electronic voting. There's some that are free in the back to journalists. The half of the book was footnotes in response to there's no evidence of vote tampering or computers malfunctioning. So we thought we would add about 300 pages of sites on the internet just to verify that that happens. Again, I would encourage you to go to the freepress.org website. We also have an ebook, Harvey Wasserman, and I, as I introduce the rest of the panel. Harvey's the senior editor at the Columbus Free Press, freepress.org, and the Institute. And again, Lori Grace, who we've been working with since 2009, is the founder of the Institute for American Democracy and Election Integrity. She'll talk briefly about what she's doing with the tracking bird system, which is a very easy system to actually track voting, particularly OptiScan voting. And in Ohio, we're well aware that the Election Assistance Commission found that more than 10% of the votes that were on a scanned piece of paper were counted wrong in the city of Cleveland. So a very democratic city. So even though there was a paper scan, it counted it wrong when it came to counting the ballots. Mark Crispin Miller, who again in many ways has provided the great intellectual work and been in the trenches, not only NYU professor of communication, but really wrote the seminal book, Fooled Again. We'll be putting this in historical context of what is happening here. And Jill Simpson, who some of you may have seen on 60 Minutes, good friend of Karl Rove. Well, maybe at one time, no longer a good friend, is in fact gone all over the country. You know, I'm sure if you talk to her later, that many of those were very early flights, and she's really done an incredible job of kind of putting together this Karl Rove empire of these really strange, small, secretive, I hate to call them fronts, but that's what they appear to be, that are going to count our votes in this election. And Jim March, a longtime activist, has worked with Bev Harris at BlackBoxVoting and really has all sorts of technical computer skills as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Harvey to talk briefly about some stories we have just broke on freepress.org. There is a petition to the Justice Department. 44,000 people have signed it, demanding an investigation of Solomare and the Hig Capital, which appeared directly connected to the Romney family capital investment that just happened to have bought Hart Intercivic, the third largest voting machine company in America. They bought that July of last year. So one of the major campaigns. And 3 of the 5 directors that run Hig Capital used to work for Bain Company, and 2 are major bundlers, raising all sorts of money for the Romney campaign, at the same time counting the votes in 2 major counties in California, Orange County and San Mateo, all of Texas. And again, the key area of Ohio, the narrative on the Today Show is how goes Ohio goes the election, and how goes Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is, goes Ohio. Hart Intercivic will be counting the vote, which has major investment from Bain Company and from Romney's personal private family funds. So keeping that in mind, let me turn it over to Harvey Wasserman.
Okay, I'm going to introduce Mark, and then I will speak after Mark. We do have 3 academics here. Bob is a professor of political science as well as an attorney. I teach history, and Mark Crispin Miller is the communications expert here, professor at New York University. So Mark is going to give us an overview. We are making YouTubes here, so making history as well. as making YouTubes. I think that's the way it goes these days. Either YouTube comes first or the history comes first. Maybe you can explain it to that. So we're going to keep our remarks to 10 minutes or under to keep you both awake and in the YouTube world. So Mark, if you'll take it away, please.
Okay, thanks. I'm really very happy to be here with all of you, this distinguished panel. Now, if we were talking about election fraud in Iran, or Venezuela, or Russia, we probably would have had to rent Carnegie Hall, and the place would be packed, because everybody will be very worked up about these various rogue nations and sinister powers subverting democracy through various sly means or old-fashioned means. It doesn't make any difference. But when we talk about election fraud in the United States, we're usually marginalized and accused of conspiracy theory. Just yesterday, NBC's Chuck Todd, NBC's elections expert Chuck Todd, sent out a tweet to his followers saying that e-vote concerns are conspiracy garbage, like the Trump birther theory. Okay? This is the line on any argument or discussion, any argument about or discussion of the voluminous evidence, the copious, precise, and specific, solid evidence of stolen elections in this country since 2000. It's beyond dispute that this has been happening. It is certainly beyond dispute that it could happen. The government itself, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, the Argonne Laboratory, they have all demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that our voting system, our computerized, privatized voting system, could be subverted, could be manipulated extremely easily by players with 8th grade science educations. That this could happen is beyond question. And that's something that that's a fact that does get some coverage. That it has happened is a fact that is only discussed in a whisper, if at all. And that's, as I said before, routinely dismissed as conspiracy theory by the mainstream media, and, shockingly, treated in the same way by most of the left liberal press. The progressive media tends to be just as hostile to any attempt to discuss these things as the mainstream press. We could do a whole separate panel to question why this is. The fact of the matter is that we are now facing another election that is at serious risk of theft by a fanatical minority movement. The Republican Party of today is not your grandfather's Republican Party. It's extremely different. Starting in the 90s, it was gradually seized by a combination of theocratic Christianists. The moral majority, which many of you may remember, did not disappear, but sort of melted into the Republican Party. And that component of the right has teamed up with radical economic libertarians like the Koch brothers and others, people close to Karl Rove. Between these Christianist theocrats and these very, very powerful plutocratic players, you've got a movement that has its very strong hands tightly gripping the machinery of voting and vote counting in the United States. Just to give you one quick example, ES&S and Diebold, which for a long time were the two biggest e-voting companies in the United States, were originally one company called American Information Systems. AIS was founded by Bob and Todd Urosevich, a couple of Christianists from the Midwest who are still involved at the top of both ES&S and, well, it can't be Diebold anymore, but Diebold has now been bought up by Dominion. It's complicated, but even though the details are complicated, the general trend is very simple, that most of the votes in the United States are counted by a cartel whose owners and managers arguably don't believe in democracy. That's not why they got into this game. They are part of and very close to a Republican Party that's pushing an agenda that has no considerable popular support. The American people, despite what they may think often, are a lot more progressive than we've all been led to believe on issue after issue. They do not really support, they don't come close to supporting the Scott Walker agenda or the Sarah Palin agenda or the Koch brothers agenda. That's precisely why election theft is a necessity for these players, because they cannot carry the day through traditional democratic means. I'm going to make one last point, and then I'm going to yield the floor to my distinguished co-panelists. It is permissible to talk about vote suppression, and there's been plenty of coverage of the various Jim Crow laws that have been passed, photo ID requirements and so on, changing the residency rules so that students can't vote. There's been plenty of coverage of this kind of thing, even by the New York Times. There's also been plenty of coverage of Citizens United and the destructive effect that unlimited campaign cash that's shoveled into the coffers of really both parties, but especially the Republican Party, by really powerful corporate players. These two things are permissible to discuss. What we have to understand is that the theft of elections is a very sophisticated two-step process. The first step entails shrinking the pool of eligible voters before Election Day. That's what we are allowed to talk about. We are allowed to talk about all the money that's used to buy campaign propaganda. We are allowed to talk about, as I said before, we are allowed to talk about the photo ID requirements and the various tricks and tactics used to disenfranchise people prior to Election Day. Now that job's pretty much been done by now. The Times just ran a big piece about the toll that's been taken by all these laws, which were basically promoted by ALEC, A-L-E-C, the big legislative shop that's run and financed by the Koch brothers. Okay? That's only the first step, however. Once you have shrunk the pool of eligible voters by getting rid of as many Black and Hispanic and student and elderly voters as possible, then it's necessary to use the election system itself, the voting system itself, to shave 100 votes off the total in this precinct, shave 250 votes off the total in that precinct, concoct ghost votes as need be. See? You can't just disenfranchise a lot of people and then hope for the best. If you're really serious about seizing power, and not just the White House, but state houses and Congress as well, you're not going to leave anything to chance. And as Jill's going to point out, when it comes to manipulating the machinery in this way, Karl Rove and his friends are extremely brilliant. Okay? That's sufficient?
More than?
Okay. So, please, let me just say one last thing. The theft of the election in Ohio in 2004, and Jill may talk about this a little bit, was overseen by Karl Rove's then IT guru, a man named Mike Connell. That's a fascinating story. I can't go into all of its details, other than to say that he set up a computer system, it's called Man in the Middle, that involved shunting all the real-time election returns in Ohio that night to a separate computer in a basement in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where those involved could stop the flow, manipulate the flow, change the numbers. It's the kind of trick that criminals of all kinds play, usually to steal money from banks and so on. Mike Connell set this up, all right? Then, after a deposition that Bob was actually instrumental in making happen, and before he was supposed to be deposed again, Connell perished when his small plane crashed as he was on his way home to Akron from College Park. I'm only here to say that the contract that Connell signed with Ken Blackwell's office is publicly available. You can find it by going to my blog at markcrispinmiller.com. The actual contract that Connell signed with the Secretary of State's office, specifically a Christianist in that office named Monty Lobb. So that's just one piece of the countless pieces of hard evidence that we have that our elections have not gone way over to the right because of the will of the electorate, but rather because those elections have been manipulated to that end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I want to say Mark's been instrumental, one of the very few people of his stature and standing that have been willing to take this issue on. And his article in Harper's and his books have been extremely important to the process of getting the word out about this. And this is another one here. Harper's finally how to steal an election. So as a historian, I want to very quickly say that, like most historians, American historians, I've been aware for many years that stealing elections is part of the great American tradition. In fact, the 1800 election was stolen based on the 3/5 bonus. Thomas Jefferson used that, the 3/5 bonus that was granted to slave owners to vote their slaves, but not to let them actually vote. But had it not been for that, and the Electoral College, which is a big part of this, John Adams would have been reelected. In 1824, John Quincy Adams used the Electoral College to steal an election. It happened again in 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes, in 1888 with Benjamin Harrison, and we believe the 1896 election was also stolen. So there is a great American tradition here of stealing elections. And it would not be possible in this day and age, by the way, without the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a big part of the problem. We need to get rid of the Electoral College. There's no reason why the presidency should be decided by just a few choice swing states. You here in New York, people in California, Texas may not even as well bother to vote for presidency. And this is absurd. It's a carryover from slavery. So one of the things Bob Fitrakis and I at the Free Press have been advocating for a long time is the abolition of the Electoral College. And we will not have fair presidential elections in this country until that is done. It will require a constitutional amendment, but it needs to be done. Bob Fitrakis and I were involved in this because Bob is a professor at Columbus State University in Columbus, Ohio, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and we witnessed in 2004 the theft of an election. It happened right before our eyes. It was done 100 different ways. We have published 5 books about this. Our latest is Will the GOP Steal America's 2012 Election? We know pretty much what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. As Mark mentioned, it boils down to 2 basic strategies. You disenfranchise as much of the public as you possibly can with a national Jim Crow strategy, and that has gotten some publicity, and then you swing the vote with electronic voting machines. That has still been responded to by the major media, the corporate media, with some hostility. Now we have immediate historical roots of this. It was done in 2000 in Florida, where electronic voting machines in Volusia County temporarily at least reversed between 16 and 20,000 votes and opened the door for the theft of that election in 2000 from Al Gore, and who has not said a word about this, by the way, since it happened. He said a lot about global warming, and then global warming begins by him saying that the inconvenient truth begins by him saying, I was once the next president of the United States, as if it was some kind of joke. Al Gore was legitimately elected in the year 2000 by the American public and never stood up for it. Same thing with John Kerry in 2004. We have documented, as Mark Crispin Miller has said here and many others, beyond dispute that the 2004 election was stolen. There's simply no way around the overwhelming mountain of evidence that through electronic voting machines, systematic disenfranchisement, and as many other dirty tricks as Karl Rove could come up with, that John Kerry had been legitimately elected President of the United States, and yet George W. Bush served a second term in the White House. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected primarily because tens of thousands of people came out all over the country, based in part, inspired by the writings of Mark Crispin Miller, Bob Fitrakis, and others at thefreepress.org and elsewhere around the country. Greg Palast, Brad Friedman, BlackBoxVoting, which is represented here today. We finally did make the case to the public that if people did not come out to protect the election, it would be stolen. And now we're facing a rerun of this in 2012. Unfortunately, many of the people who came out in 2008 have been inspired by Barack Obama. They're less inspired this year, but I will guarantee you that if people don't turn out at the polls in droves, this election will be stolen. Now, Bob and I pointed out in an article that at thefreepress.org, which did go viral on the internet, that the Republican Party this year controls the governorships and Secretary of State's offices in 9 key swing states: in Florida, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, New Mexico, and Arizona. We have Republican governors and Republican secretaries of state. And that is a surefire formula for stealing an election. They can disenfranchise people up front, which they are doing, and when it comes time to count the electronic votes, there is nothing to stop them from flipping the vote. There is no, and it's hard to say this, but this is the core fact about the American elections today. There is no public recourse on the count of electronic voting machines. A Secretary of State, in the dead of night, without any public scrutiny, can flip an election in a matter of minutes. We saw it happen in Ohio in 2004. It was done by J. Kenneth Blackwell, the Secretary of State, Michael Connell, and a number of other people in a basement, or electronically in a basement in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We have no doubt that this was done. And it will be done again in 2012 if the Republicans need it to be done. If Barack Obama is not ahead nationwide and in the key swing states by 5% or more, it will be a very easy thing to do for them to do to flip this election. Now, we've now seen a couple of editorial cartoons, one by a guy named Dan Wasserman, who's not related to me, although I'd like to meet him someday, at the Boston Globe. There have been a couple of other cartoons that have come out emphasizing the possibility that these electronic voting machines can be flipped. But the public has not faced this. The government has not faced the reality that we are looking at the possibility in the dead of night at a very quick flip of this election, about which nothing can be done. There is no legal recourse. The courts have ruled that the software in these electronic voting machines, even if they're owned by the counties or the states in which they're being used, the software is proprietary to the companies that own them. We have no way to crack their code and to monitor these electronic voting machines. Bob Fitrakis and I at FreePress.org are trying to set up an on-the-ground monitoring system in Ohio to get at this as best we possibly can. But the public is going to have to face the reality that until we get universal voter registration, every citizen must be automatically registered at the age of 18. Until we get universal hand-counted paper ballots, where, and our advocacy is that we have Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday are national holidays where everybody can come out and vote. On Tuesday, all the students, all the high school and college students in the country come out, they run the polls and they count the votes. Everything has to be hand-counted, everything has to be paper ballot. I would point out that the country of Ireland has just thrown its electronic voting machines out and reverted back to hand-counted paper ballots. That's the case in Japan, in Germany, in Canada, and in Switzerland. We need to go to that system. Until we have universal hand-counted paper ballots and universal automatic citizen voter registration, we are not going to have guaranteed fair elections and vote counting in this country. And so we are facing a major crisis right now. Bob Fitrakis and I and Jerry Bello have just broken another story. It's hard to say this with a straight face, and I'll finish with this. The Romney family has, as Bob has mentioned, a direct financial interest in the voting machines that will count the votes in Hamilton County, Ohio, and elsewhere, where the election could be decided. We are in an election campaign where one of the candidates has a financial vested interest and ownership interest in the electronic voting machines that will decide the election. And yet this news should be all over the country. Everybody should be talking about this. The Justice Department should be involved. There should be a major investigation and certainly a major rebellion against the use of hard intercivic voting machines anywhere in this country because they're partly owned by one of the candidates. If we can't face this kind of reality, do we really have a democracy? The only way we're going to have a democracy in this country, and I'll finish, is that we must have hand-counted paper ballots. We must have universal voter registration. And the election of 2012, will be stolen, or at least bought. John Kennedy's father was a great exception when people said that Illinois was stolen in 1960. He said he paid for it fair and square. And I think the Romney family is going to be able, unless we are careful, unless we move now, we are very close to election day. Unless we move now, this election will be paid for fair and square by the Romney family and the other multi-billionaires who are supporting all these groups. It defies common sense to think that these super PACs, all this Citizens United money that's being spent, hundreds of millions of dollars, that they would spend this amount of money on a campaign and not spend the extra pocket change that it will take them to flip the election electronically at the end. So we are begging people to please face this reality, look at the electronic voting machines, look at the national Jim Crow, and finally let's get a democracy in this country. Thank you very much.
And finally, we've got Jill and Jim. Jill will Lori will be summing up the solution, one of the solutions at the end. But Jill's going to take us for a little tour of these voting machine companies. My favorite, Jill, is the house in a suburban neighborhood, which was the U.S. headquarters of Silent, but only the first level of the house. Jill.
Yeah.
Probably should dim the lights a
Can we go
little
to the
bit.
audience and watch it? Is that better?
Okay. I'll tell y'all a little about how I got started doing this. Basically, I, this year, at the conclusion of the Siegelman matter before the Supreme Court, decided I was going to seminary. And so I packed my bags to go to my very first seminary class in Phoenix, Arizona. And the seminary I was going to is Star King Seminary, which is at Berkeley. And had decided that I was going to do absolutely zero this year with politics. I'd had it since Siegelman did not even get heard at the Supreme Court level. So I packed my bags. I go to Phoenix, Arizona to protest against Sheriff Joe Arpaio's tent city, because I considered that to be a prophetic witness of what I had seen, and to come back and tell my community about Hispanics and the conditions that they were living in under the migration and getting caught, and the immigration and getting caught and placed in this tent city. And my focus from then forward in my head was going to be solely that this was going to be my religious journey. And I was going to use my activism for what I was going to be doing at seminary. And I had no desire to do any more politics. And I had made that perfectly clear. On the first day that I arrived at seminary in Phoenix to do the protest at Tent City, Karl Rove got on Fox News and suggested that I, Jill Simpson, was working with the White House with Obama and his attorney, who is Bob Bauer. And he basically said that me and Bob Bauer had conspired against him on the Siegelman matter on Fox. Greta Van Susteren was in shock because this had nothing to do with what she was questioning him about. And he then went on roughly a 20 to 30 minute rant and rave about me. And so and really about also Bob Bauer and the Siegelman matter. So I basically said, well, this is interesting. Here I am the first day at seminary, and Karl Rove is talking about me. I'm leaving him alone. So I said, I'm just going to ignore it, kind of. But I did write a letter to poor Bob Bauer because I had never met him before. And I'm very thankful that Karl contacted him and claimed that I worked for him, because it proved what a liar he was. Bob Bauer, the president's attorney, had never met me, yet he claimed I worked for Bob Bauer. So I sent Bob Bauer a letter, and I basically told Bob, I'm done with this, I'm doing seminary, but here's a couple of things you ought to know. And here's an affidavit. I figured, well, since I started with an affidavit in Siegelman, I would end with an affidavit in Siegelman. And here's an affidavit, Bob, that says, I don't know you. And by the way, you ought to be thankful I sent you this affidavit. So, while you're at it, why don't you grant us a pardon in the Siegelman case? Which we were pretty much, our backs were up against the wall. We had nowhere to go. So I really kind of owe Karl a thank you for introducing me to a guy he claimed I worked for. And so I basically turned around then and said, I'm just going to focus on seminary once again. So that's the start of this. So we will start with our opening page. You need to go back to my opening page. Page 1. Actually to the front page, the very first. Okay, there. So basically I had decided just to focus on seminary. But I told my friend Cliff Arnbach that I felt like maybe my plans of going to seminary might get sidetracked somehow since he had mentioned me. But I wasn't really sure how. So Cliff told me, he said, well, have you ever thought about doing any election work as part of your seminary experience? I said, well, no, I really haven't thought about that. I don't really think I want to necessarily. But what ended up happening is the result of the slideshow. We have formed an NGO now called Election Protection Action. And we are going to clean up this country's political problems when it comes to elections. So this is the start, and basically the way it all started is Cliff said, well, you know, there's some people might want to meet with you and stuff like that. Why don't you visit with them while you're out there at seminary? So now you flip to Starkey. So I arrived at Starkey, and basically the first person I meet who comes and picks me up after a day of class is Jim Marsh, who is the black box voting guy. And Jim asked me if I would be interested in traveling around, because I kind of told him how the system worked and kind of hoped that I would not be part of it. Jim, just please quit flipping. Go back to the front, and I'll tell you when to flip, okay? Flip. I'll flip it myself. So, you know. Okay. So basically, I told Jim exactly kind of where the locations were, and I thought Jim would go off. Well, he kind of made me what I guess you'd call an indecent proposal, because he said, why don't you go with me? And so I basically said, well, you know, I'm doing seminary, I don't know. But then, once again, Carl Rove intervenes. He basically turns around and goes to the Republican convention and rants and raves and blames me for Craig Unger's book. He says, I know, it's her. She's the one who's told you all this. But basically, what?
The title's Boss Rove.
Boss Rove. So basically, I was like, okay, Jim, I'll go on your adventure. So basically, that is what I did. Now, I think y'all all should probably know this guy, and I'm not sure if you do, but I was the witness in the Don Siegelman case. And I'd like to straighten a little bit of this out for folks before I move forward, since I've got a chance to do this today. When I came forward in the Siegelman case, I already came forward in the October before the Siegelman case. And actually, what I had done in October of 2006, and this is kind of the start of how I ended up being a whistleblower, and it's never really made it to mainstream. But what happened is they asked me, the Republicans, which was like Bill Canary and Bob Riley and Carl Rove, asked me to kind of attack a guy named Lowell Barron, who is in Alabama, who was the senator, president pro tem in the Alabama Senate. There was one problem. His brother had been my banker and my father's banker, and I had known them my whole entire life, and I said, I'm not going to do that. And so they kept trying to force me to do that, so I told his brother, who asked me, and told the plans of what they intended to do in 2006. And basically, they asked me to speak with a lawyer that was Lowell's lawyer, and I told him that they were fixing to file a whole bunch of stuff and everything like that. 2 weeks after I told them what their game plan was, they did everything I said. So, basically, I did not originally come forward for the Siegelman case. I originally came forward for the Lowell Barron case. And everything I told was basically proven to be true from those. And They did not win that 2006 election because I told them what was going to happen against Lowell. But in 2010, they defeated him. Now, here's the deal on the Siegelman case, so you understand. When I was speaking to the lawyer on Lowell Barrett's case, he said, "Good God, Jill." He said, "They asked you to do this against Lowell? Why?" And I said, "Well, here's the deal, so you know. I did all those pictures in the Don Siegelman's case. Well, that lawyer just happened to have represented Don during that time. And when he heard my story, he said, 'You need to come forward on the Siegelman case as well.' And I said, I called Siegelman's lawyer, and I tried to tell him the story, and I left a message for him to call me, but he never returned my call." So basically, what ended up happening was this, is he told me he thought I needed to speak to the Alabama Bar Association to determine whether I should have to tell this story or not. So I contacted them, and they said, "Yeah, considering that the judge has a $200 million contract that went off right during the middle of the Siegelman case, you probably have a duty to tell what you knew, especially since you're telling us that he has contracts with the FBI and with the ATF." When I told my story to 60 Minutes, the portion of the 60 Minutes story that wound up on the floor was about the $200 million judge, who actually, as it turned out, had over $5 billion worth of contracts by the time we were done with this spring. Yet he doesn't think that any reasonable man or woman in America would have a conflict with having a judge who has, $5 billion worth of contracts with the United States government, all of which a group of folks connected to Karl Rove helped him get. So therein is why I included him. Now I'm going to tell you how a country girl ends up on the cover of Time magazine, as far as in articles and things of that nature. And my picture was not on there, but her story was. And here's the deal. When I came forward, they asked me to do an affidavit on a one-day circumstance, which was about a call that had been made to Carl from Bill Canary that they were talking about with Bill Canary and with Rob Riley, and what had been said. So I did this affidavit thinking that it was going to be filed in court. Well, a couple of days after that, I get a call from a guy named Adam Zagorian. And basically what Adam wanted to know was my story. So I told him where I'd been and what I'd done. And of course, he just picked the pieces of the Siegelman matter. He didn't tell my whole entire story, as it's a long and involved story. However, Carl over the years has said, "Well, she did this affidavit and it doesn't say anything about me except this one thing." But I was asked to do an affidavit on one particular day, one particular incident. And actually, it's kind of funny, I really didn't want dragged into this whole matter originally. I thought I could tell them the story about the judge having, $400 or $500 million worth of government contracts, and they would get him thrown out and no one would ever know about me, because I provided them a copy of every single solitary contract. But by the time I went to testify up in D.C. about it, Carl was going, "She read Scott Horton, and she read all these articles that basically said this about Fuller. Yet I am the very person who called the Alabama bar and told them at the very beginning, do I have to come forward since I know this about the judge?" So, and in fact, I was a source for Scott Horton on the contracts. As a result of this Time magazine article, which did not contain any reference really that was suggestive that I was Carl's best friend or anything, Carl goes screaming out there, "I don't know her. I've never met her." And of course I was like laughing, because I was like, this is not your part of the story, Carl. I wasn't trying to include you. I was telling what happened on a phone call where they were talking about you. But he immediately rushes out ahead to announce to the world that he doesn't know me, which is really a sad and unfortunate thing for him, because my family goes back to the Bush family all the way until the 1979, when my sister worked for George H.W. Bush at his bank, River Oaks Bank and Trust. So anyway, that's the gist of my story. So due to his unreasonable attacks, I decided, since he had just kept attacking me, and I mean, I had not even talked about him in over a year when he went on this bender in the summer with me and Bob Bauer, nor had I spoken with him on this Craig Unger thing. And since he decided to do that, I decided to do him a favor and tell about his election operation. So that is what I did. So the first thing we did was we went, Jim and I, to Smart Tech. And I'm just going to take me to the pictures. Here's us.
Hi, folks. My name is Jim March. I'm a member of the board of directors of BlackBoxVoting. I'm also a member of the board of Southern Arizona chapter of ACLU. Standing next to me is the lovely Jill Simpson, and she's very familiar with where we're at. Say hello to Mr. Pioneer, the star of the long-running star of the Pioneer building, where Capital Mark Mortgage is the biggest name on the side of the building. But we also have a few companies upstairs that should be of note to anybody interested in subjects like politics and elections.
And basically, that shows the Pioneer Bank building. And I've attached that, and y'all will be able to watch. Well, you've got to.
Headquarters.
You went to the very end of the slideshow.
Well, okay. Well, I'm going to go after that. I do not want to play that. Okay, because we don't have time. As a result of that, we went into the Smart Tech Center, and I picked the week to go that Carl was in town, because I figured there would be less people there. And so we went to the Pioneer building in Chattanooga and took video of the inside, went down to the basement where the missing servers are, and while we were there, I ended up stumbling on some sources, and which was great. And I'm just going to flip this on over. And there's the, right there is the basement where all the missing servers are. Now, what's important to understand about Smart Tech, when I used to help in that building, and the way Smart Tech really kind of came into Carl's form of being was in 2000, Chattanooga, Tennessee was the obvious location to meet because Al Gore was in Nashville. And you actually could kind of do your operation a little out of his presence, and he was running for president. And you could do it in Chattanooga. And all the activists, including myself, we would meet at Smart Tech. And the basement contained all the servers. And that, behind those doors, I believe is probably still the servers that contain the White House information. Nobody's ever really pushed to get those servers. And because they didn't realize one thing, Smart Tech are a retrieval specialist. Now, they've tried to claim they lost the emails, but they have also claimed over the years that they can retrieve anything whatsoever. So House guys who make the representation that they lost all the White House emails also claim that they can retrieve everything. And this operation is ran by Jeff Averbeck, but it was originally started by a guy named Mikey Cunningham, or Michael Cunningham. He goes by Mikey Cunningham. And Mikey, he is famous for having made the guts of the machinery for the BlackBerry. He also did all the Nextlex stuff for the cell phone towers. He's quite the inventor. And he also is famous for doing the live stream in video as well. And one of the people that he did live streaming for was, of course, the first Woodstock when they did it. A lot of people are familiar with that. And basically, Mikey was kind of the genius going at that time. Since about 2001, 2002, Jeff Averbeck moved in because Mikey kind of got in some financial trouble. But out of this ST3, then Smart Tech, they ran over 30,000 miles of cable so that they could use that cable line to transmit things. And they are in what you call the Tennessee Tech corridor between NASA and between Knoxville. And so they're an interesting lot of people. And at Smart Tech, the kind of things we did when I was doing was we would run choice points at that time. And choice point documents were basically investigative reports that we would run against senators and congressmen and things of that nature. And then I would track them. So I didn't technically, as a volunteer, work in that office, but I worked out of that office, but I would get reports from that office. So that is kind of my dealings. But while we were there looking in gym, I ran across a tip that told me that the election this time, the man in the middle was going to be moved in all likelihood, and gave me a location. And also, I learned, surprisingly enough to know, that the special ops OPSEC was being run off the Smart Tech servers. Now, I don't know, are y'all familiar with OPSEC? Okay, well, what OPSEC is it's a group of special forces guys that have come together that work directly for Karl Rove that are speaking out against Obama for basically being proud that he killed Osama bin Laden. Karl has always said that the beauty of being an operative is being able to turn somebody's best aspect into their worst. And, I mean, you know, Karl would have given his right arm and his eye, and his mouth, to have had his president, George W. Bush, have taken out Osama bin Laden. But he did not take him out. President Obama did. And the way we prove the OPSEC deal is this. It's on March 8th, the OPSEC article was created. And on March 8th, the article was created. The site was created. On March 22nd, Karl Rove basically got on the Wall Street Journal, in the Wall Street Journal, and said real plainly, you know, I think it's horrible that President Obama is using the United States military. On March 26th, basically what happened was all of the OPSEC stuff was moved onto the Smart Tech servers by Donatelli Connell. And Connell, of course, is the gentleman who passed away, as Mark Crispin Miller said a few minutes ago, in the fiery plane crash in Ohio. But basically, we have a source who helped us, and we've got a copy, and I'm just going to show it, I'm not going to show it, that is 34 pages of their game plan as to how they were going to run their OPSEC that is attached to our video program, which will be in our slideshow, which will be on the web shortly.
Okay, we really have to get to the election stuff itself.
Okay.
If we could get to that, that'd be great.
Pictures of the buildings.
The buildings.
Okay. What we've got here is Mercer Reynolds' office in Ohio. Mercer Reynolds and Bill DeWitt is the partners of, and he's got Mercer Reynolds, but they are the partners of Karl Rove, and they are who makes the financial world go around for Karl Rove. And one of our first stops was visiting their Cincinnati office. And this is one of the main money sources and where a lot of the Texas money comes from. And actually, they are the ones who did the Bush Rangers and the Pioneers. The Pioneers being from the operation at Smart Tech the Rangers being the baseball team that they were invested with George W. Bush in. Flip. The next location that we went to was Crossroads Strategies, which is ran by G. Stewart Hall. I helped with the original story anonymously on Crossroads Strategies. Before Carl announced it, we ran articles with a group of reporters that were connected to the Siegelman team that Carl was running Crossroads Strategies. The reason I did that is because G. Stewart Hall went to school with me at the University of Alabama, and I had worked with Stewart on campaigns. So when I heard that Stewart was forming a new corporation, I had a bunch of folks out in Washington go and get a copy of this, and this is several years back. But this is Carl and Stewart's operation in Washington, D.C., and it's a couple of blocks, 4 blocks from the White House. The next place that Carl operates out of is the Westgate building in Austin, Texas. And one of the reasons that we provided a copy of all the locations is so that activists like us can go and protest, and they'll know exactly where to go and protest when there's problems. And this office building is where his now wife, Karen Johnson, works out of. But it's his office. And you'll notice that Jim and I are standing on the portico at the state capitol, and the Westgate is behind us. And to the left of the Westgate is the governor's mansion, so he actually could just walk across the street. And that's been his office all the time, and that is called the Infrastructure Solutions, Inc. part of his operation. Go ahead. The next place that I decided to take Jim on a tour of while down in Texas was in Houston, and this is the election center. And to me, this is one of the scariest places in the world. And you can't see good on this picture unless you blow it up on the internet, but there's bars on the windows. And it's located behind the strip mall. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the place that is responsible for teaching all the election directors in the country. Can y'all imagine? And I mean, it is phenomenal. And the guy who runs it, his name's R. Doug Lewis. And R. Doug Lewis, basically, R. Doug was a Republican. He was a Democrat first, and he actually worked for a guy named John Connolly. And then John switched to being a Republican. And so when young Carl arrived back after having toted CIA George Bush, H.W. Bush's briefcase in Washington, when he came back to Texas from their stint at the CIA, basically what happened is Carl made contact with R. Doug Lewis, who was the finance director of Texas. And he was also additionally the executive director for a period of time. And Carl started working in the Texas campaigns. R. Doug was the guy who ran Jerry Ford's campaign also for president down in Texas. But sometime around the end of the 70s, R. Doug decided that there ought to be some more money in elections. And so he decided to form an election center where he trained all of the directors across the country. Also, R. Doug was the guy who ended up certifying all of the election machines. Jim could tell you more about this because Jim and Bill Harris spent an amount of time kicking R. Doug out of the election certifying business. But he's still running international elections because he trains the election directors all over the country. And that is his central headquarters in Houston, Texas. Next slide. Also, as I told y'all earlier, we had gotten a tip that when we were at the Smart Tank office that we might want to go see Skytle USA's headquarters. And I'm like, why would we want to go see Skytle USA's headquarters? Because they were a company that I was not familiar with. And they said, well, they're in Richmond, Virginia, and I think they're going to be the man in the middle. My source did. And I was like, how are they going to be the man man in the middle. They said, just look up the headquarters and go visit. So I went to Skyler, USA in Glen Allen, Virginia, and to my shocking dismay, I did not find an office, but a house with a man sitting at a table. And as Jim got out to take the pictures, the man was peeping out and watching us. Well, I told Bob Fitrakis, his partner, Cliff Arnbeck, who happened to be my lawyer through some of this mess with Carl on the Siegelman matter. And as it turns out, the headquarters for the MOVE Act for the United States and for all the voting for like 900 different municipalities and cities, major places, is ran out of this joint. So Bob, looking at this, turned around and he basically ran a story on it. The day after he ran a story, guess what? They moved the office. They wrote a letter to the EAC and said, we're moving their office. Because they knew we had been in their front yard looking and that it was a house. And I really, to this day, will believe that we found the guy's house and the man in the middle because he had control of the central
Do you want to tell what Seigel's going to do in this election?
tabulator. Okay, do y'all want to know, I mean, if I run a little over, is it going to matter if you're learning?
Should I explain that?
Yeah, but let me say this first. Basically, let's show the other picture, and then I'll let you tell a little about the MOVE Act. But anyway, here's the deal. At Skytle, so we decided to check out the location where they're moving to. But we had already checked this out because I'd gotten wind that there was another location that they might be operating out of, but it was bogus too. But that was before, but we didn't tell that part of the story because we wanted to catch them. So what we did is Bob just told part of the story about the house. Well, they went berserk when they saw the picture of the house, and the very next day they said, we've got another location, which happened to be one Jim and I had already visited, which was in Baltimore, at the Baltimore headquarters, another headquarters of Skyler, the new Skyler headquarters. And basically what we found in Baltimore, across from the harbor at the Inner Harbor building, was a virtual office that you can rent a space for like $349 if you get all the services. And of course, the day that Jim and I arrived, there was no one there to speak to us. And that was before they wrote this letter to say we have moved locations. Sadly for them, they fixed one fraudulent location with another, in that neither place was operational. Now, why this is important is because of the fact that they have spent so much time saying that the United States elections, these 900 cities and major states and municipalities that are using them, is because of the fact that they are ran by a Spanish corporation. And the reality, folks, is from here forward, we're going to be talking about the fact that our American elections are no longer ran by the United States of America, which is something that we've got to fix. And why? And when we were looking at them, we knew going in, and this was not one I had learned, Skyler was not one I had learned, but we knew this was the location from our source at Smart Tech that the man in the middle might be located at. And so when we got to both the locations, we were like, oh, we found a house and we found an office building that nobody's in that's a virtual office. Our elections are being ran in Spain. So that's the first portion of it. But additionally, part of my tip involved the MOVE Act. And basically, that gives these guys access to the central tabulators. And so Jim's going to explain that, and I'll let him explain that, and then I'll go back through a few minutes.
It's really simple, folks. There was a new federal law passed in 2009 called the MOVE Act, Military Overseas Voter Enhancement. What it was supposed to do is streamline the process for the people overseas voting into the U.S. And by the way, the foreign consulates, foreign contractors, U.S. citizens overseas and military are all lumped together into the same process. Most people don't know that. The new process under the MOVE Act says that those voters have to be given a choice to register to vote electronically and actually vote electronically over the internet. Okay? There were no security standards set up in the MOVE Act. It was patterned after the Help America Vote Act of 2002, in which, same deal, the federal government was going to supply new money for new computers to support these laws. But in the case of the MOVE Act, money was being supplied by the feds, but there were no security provisions even talked about in the MOVE Act, unlike the previous Help America Vote Act. Last time the feds gave counties money for voting, they gave them security standards they had to follow. In the MOVE Act, not only were there no security standards, but the states and counties were not allowed to enact security requirements stronger than the feds. So the feds said you have to allow these guys to vote over the internet. And you can't set up security provisions that says, wait a minute, that's potentially a problem. Several companies moved into the area of MOVE Act software, but by far the biggest player was Skytle, however you pronounce their name, in combination with ES&S. They have formed a partnership in ES&S and Skytle, but Skytle was the main software developers. ES&S apparently did some US support functions. That software has to be able to write votes into the central tabulator and has to be able to write new voter registrations into the voter registration database. So not only can it affect the votes for the overseas military and standard citizen overseas voters, it can in theory affect, or I almost want to say the word infect, the rest of the election process in each county where this kind of software is used. Now, there are some states, such as Wyoming, that are in revolt and are saying, no, we're not playing along. And guess what? Mitt Romney's campaign is now suing them for their lack of compliance with this setup. Yeah. Romney's campaign is suing Wyoming and several other states for their failure to enact all the reforms in the MOVE Act and the military overseas voting process. So, Skytle is the biggest player in MOVE Act compliance. One of the things we found out about Skytle at the House headquarters, the Department of Justice paid $800 million for custom software services. $800,000, sorry. Did I say $800,000? $800,000 for custom software services payable to Skytle at that House address. Now, why would the Pentagon be paying for custom software in relation to voting is beyond me, but I can't think of a perfectly good explanation. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, one of the people, and he'll later play a role, because he's kind of a thread that weaves through all these, which is Bob Fitrakis. For a period of time, he was the president of Skytle. And we believe that Bob kind of coordinates everything. I know when I was an operative in Tennessee and working for them, I often heard his name mentioned. So that's one of the reasons we went to all the locations where he was at, in addition to the fact that we had gotten this tip that we needed to go see the house in particularly, because that was a good location where the guy would have access to the tabulator by himself at the kitchen table.
Joe, can I ask you a question? Are you saying that having done the man in the middle in Ohio in 2004, they're now in a position to do the same thing in several other states?
We're saying that the best location, it was the house in the middle, which we showed.
I want to know specifically what state election returns we're now supposed to worry about because of this practice. In other words, it was
900 different cities is going through.
cities and counties. We
And
don't
consider.
know how many counties are fully compliant with the MOVE Act and have uncertified software straight tied to their central.
About 25% of the counties in the country.
It's about
Quarter of all
25%.
counties, they have access.
That sounds about right.
But we wanted to find exactly where the table was located at the time to
Do
do
you
work.
know which counties? Because like in Texas, there are tiny counties with very few people. If we're talking about a large metropolitan county, a a $500,000 or $1 million or more, that becomes very
The
serious.
entire state of West Virginia, the entire state of Mississippi, we know that there are some significant areas and sizes of population in play with this stuff. But for example, West Virginia did a press release announcing their total partnership in MOVE Act with Skyline.
And you need to understand, this is what we discovered when we were looking at Skyline. Basically, it started as access to the military, that the military could vote in internet voting. But in order to allow them to register people, they had to have access to tabulators. And they also had to have access to tabulators to do the internet votes. So they have tabulators, in theory, to every single place in the United States. And until they prove otherwise to me, that's what I believe. And one of our techies, which has not made it in our report because we just had to pick and choose because we had so many sites we had seen, but one of our techies actually pulled up, and we'll have this eventually on their site, the map of where you can vote. And so you're an overseas guy and you're in Afghanistan and you want to vote in Alabama, which we have SkyTel, whatever you want to call it, in Alabama as well for the military. So if you're in the military and you're in Afghanistan, you can vote in any county. And basically, that means that they have access because they have contracted to do all the military votes. And also, there is no security. And this whole little operation has not been certified. And it's operating, and the military should be mad as well because registration is down extremely in the military this year. And this was supposed to increase it, but it decreased it. And additionally, aside from that, it gives them access to the central tabulator all over the United States for the military voting. And you have a guy who's sitting at a table running the headquarters. So I was told when we went to the Smart Tab that if I wanted to really find anything out and find my man in the middle, I'd go to Glen Abbey, Richmond. And everybody's like, what do you mean? And I'm going to tell you, me and Jim about got in a fight. He gets in my little smart car because we're going to drive up there. And he's like, why are we going to Richmond? And I said, well, I got this thing that said that we need to go. The source that told me I needed to go because they're running this out of the house. And it was an old Smart Tech friend. And so I said, so let's go. So Jim said, okay. Well, when he got there, he got extremely excited. And of course, you could see the guy running it at the table. And it was the eeriest feeling to think about the fact that this is the headquarters of the people that's voting the American military vote, which are our soldiers. So anyway, so let's move on, Jim. Oh, this is SOE.
One quick point before we leave Seidel. They also happen to own the software that was used by Total Information Awareness. They own the Carrier IQ software. The system is based on, they're going to give you a receipt, everything is private. They actually own the software that records every single keystroke, but they promise not to mix those two softwares.
So, I mean, they are terrifying when you think about the guy in the middle at the house at the table. So, anyway, as a result of that, we next went to the SOE subsidiary, which is owned by SkyTel. And if you will notice, their name is not even on the kiosk sign outside. And then Jill flipped to the other two pictures. They are listed on the board of directory. And then this is their door. And so, and the significance of this is you can hardly get in these places because they'll tell you this is private property, get off. But the interesting thing about this is looking at the space when you're standing in front of it, you realize none of this company is really operating here in the United States. It's all operating in Spain, which is hopefully my next trip. But anyway, this is the old choice point. And as many of y'all are aware of the fact, this kind of story leads us to Hank Asher, which is another one of Carl's friends. And as y'all may be aware or may not, Choice Point was used in 2000 and 2004 basically to do what I call voter caging. And so we decided to visit Hank, who is a former cocaine dealer, in addition to a lot of other things, and an admitted one, self-admitted, I might add, so I'm not telling anything. And we decided to visit his new operation down in Florida because I thought, well, we'll see what Hank's doing these days, since I knew him from Carl's days as far as knowing who he was. So what we did is we went down to TLO, which, guess what it stands for? The last one. Basically, every time somebody, a corporation that's legitimate finds out that Hank was a former self-admitted cocaine dealer during the Iran-Contra days and was Poindexter's buddy, well, they get rid of him, or he leaves, and they buy him out. And so, as a result of that, he is who we believe is the top contender as data mining selection for large election fraud systems. I used the work that Hank did at Smart Tech when I was working there using the Choice Point programs. And that would be where I would get information from individuals that I would then track to prove that they own certain assets and where their locations were for businesses and various things of that nature, and girlfriends and whatever. And
Headquarters of TLO.
okay. The interesting thing, and I will tell you this, in Hank Asher's place, when you actually go in it, Hank has a whole room, because I think this is significant, he has a whole room of desks with big, huge monitors. And we've got a videotape, and I'm not going to show it today due to time constraints, but he has flags from all over the world. Basically, what Hank is doing is he is selling American citizens information overseas and overseas information to other overseas. I mean, he's just in the business of data mining of everyone. And Hank is actually the guy who, interestingly enough to know, is the one that located the terrorist for the United States. He's a genetic algorithm program writer. And what Hank does is he writes programs that will data mine. And then through data mining, he's able to determine, for instance, like who we want to purge or who committed the World Trade Center violence. He can do anything. He can do anything that regards getting a select group of individuals who have these features. And in order to be able to operate on the Skittle system, or Seidel system, you have to be able to figure out what voters would vote and who their names are and what voters don't vote for a district. And just this week, I think it was Romney's bunch announced that they are going to know in Ohio exactly who votes by lunch, who votes by dinner, and what time you vote. And so that's going to provide even more data mining for these data miners. And what we as Americans have got to do is kind of decide what kind of data mining we want. But I looked at Hank Asher and said, let's go on down to Boca Raton. Okay. And then the next place we went was Melissa Data. And Melissa Data is in San Diego. And in San Diego, basically, we visited there. We did not get very far with these people, but these people operate something I was very familiar with, so y'all know. When I was still working out in the Smart Tech office, doing research for Choice, on the Choice Point, I would meet them up there a lot of times and get information from Carl. But what would happen is they were working on a thing called the Smart Tech wheel. And the Smart Tech wheel basically takes all the data mining and shows them who to call and who to mail to. And so either of these two operations could be used with a man in the middle scenario to say which voters can you vote. So go on, Jim. And then this is ES&S in Omaha, Nebraska. This was probably the most legitimate of the operations because they do shipping out of this. They don't do manufacturing. So the question is there machines being made here in the United States or in China and the Ukraine? Which is what I believe from the information that I got. But basically, this is Bob Fitrakis as well. And Bob is involved with Davos, Global, Premier, and Seidel, and then he went back to Premier, which is another one of our slides. And when we went to Premier in Dallas, Texas, they said he was at ES&S. And then this is Dominion, and it's located over the spaghetti factory in Denver, Colorado. Go ahead, John. And I'm not going to show you the film footage of it, but I will tell you, I confronted myself, the media person, and asked them whether or not they were ran by a company in the United States. And the guy, and whether their owner / head investor, I guess I should say, John Paulus, was an American citizen. And he told me it was none of my business. They were a private corporation, and that basically I could get off their property. And that, which was shocking, considering I thought I had a right as an American citizen to ask. And then this is my conclusions. Basically, we have just got to get these private companies out of American politics and out of the elections, and then flip them. And fixing the problem, all we've got to do is do basically that everything's got to be transparent. And if you watch the videos, which just did not have the time to do, in each of them, basically, they will not even let you in the company. They will send the secretary to the door. And the minute you say, I'm an American citizen, I'd just like to know about your company, it's like, go. So, thank you.
Just briefly, before we take questions, Lori's going to talk about, for 3 minutes, a project she's involved in, which is one of the solutions. Lori, Grace.
I think
5, go ahead. It's fine.
I imagine some of you may feel overwhelmed hearing all of this, and certainly I was too when I was discovering it. And I've been involved actually since '03, dealing with issues of election integrity. I felt really concerned when I learned about what happened in '04, and I was part of Audit the Vote and verified voting and BlackBoxVoting. I worked with Bev Harris. And I felt profoundly concerned in my heart that I was living in a country where things were stolen. Later, I was also involved in and aware of what happened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, as I was working with another person who was researching that. And so I wanted to, also, another thing, I came from a very strong Republican family, and I really care so much about integrity, whoever gets elected. And I've also functioned as a team builder as I brought in an important Republican whistleblower, a man named Stephen Spoonamore, into the mix in 2006, actually, and then he continued after that. So anyway, I wanted to say just briefly the model, since I was always wondering, why do we know these truths and why does the media never report it, all right? So basically what it is you have to follow the money. And I could say it in a soundbite for you guys. All right, if I'm a politician and I want you to vote and I want you to write me a nice check for my campaign, I don't want to look at election fraud because you're not going to write me a big check, all right? Okay? And if I'm a television and media station and I want to get all that good money from the Republican and Democratic parties and I want to get it from various advertisers who love to support the elections, I don't want to show that there's any kind of fraud because the parties may really object and I may not get their money either, okay? And then if I'm a Secretary of State and let's start. If I'm an exit poller and I'm hired by the media to come up with the election results so that all of the Americans can be satisfied with their next day of results, and it got dissed in 2004 because we were showing some different results than what ended up showing on the vote totals. Well, I don't want to discuss or show my raw data, and I want to keep on being hired, all right? So now I adjust my vote total, my raw data, my exit polls to fit the vote totals. And this country is the only country in which exit polls are not considered a gold standard of election integrity. And we are reduced to simple things like going out and videoing the vote between 10 and 12 midnight to see if we can get some precinct totals, whatever the weather is, or, I mean, that's the most recent one, and people are not investing in doing exit polls anymore because the opposition always says this is selective. You selected it so you got these people to talk, just like they said in 2004. So, the last little piece is if I'm a Secretary of State and I'm a registrar, I don't want to look like something's bad happening on my watch. I want you to vote for me again. Or I want to get promoted, all right? So, the whole thing revolves around this big elephant in the room called election fraud. And the whole game about how everybody plays depends upon not seeing that. And so that is what we have to look at. So part of the solution is, first of all, and which I did first in 2010, is to develop a prize through the Institute for American Democracy and Election Integrity for excellence for registrars and secretaries of state in supporting election integrity, all right? And we gave some awards out. Among them, we gave an award to a registrar, a very brave registrar in California, in Humboldt County, named Carolyn Cernich, the only registrar who repeatedly uses something called the Trachtenberg Election Verification System, where they actually do a second count of the votes. Yes, Hardinger Civic, partly owned by Romney, counts the votes but in this election, but they have an open source system that everybody can look at to count the votes a second time, where they take all the ballots from that county, they stuff it into a scanner, and then everybody can see it being counted who wants to. The Republicans get a CD with a summary, the Democrats get a CD with a summary, the Green Party gets a CD with a summary, and people get transparent. So what has that done to this one county in the United States, the only one there is? What's happened is the number of voters who vote in the elections are double what they are in any other California county, okay, for starters. Secondly, Carolyn Cernich was voted year after year after year after year the most popular elected official in that county, okay? Why did people stop her on the streets and say, thank you, Carolyn, for doing what you've done for our elections? Because she's supporting transparency and trust. So that is what my institute is seeking to promote to different places. I do want to let you know that the laws make it sometimes difficult to make this happen, but I would like to see this, and if there is a chaos that comes up in this coming election, this system can be made available to people to inexpensively, far less expensively than the recounts, count votes in select places. And there has been some attempt to use it in Wisconsin, but and it hasn't been completed, but for the Wisconsin election for the governor, but I wanted to let you know that this is also available. So I'm going to be continuing on promoting this because I like having a solution. I don't want to just feel depressed, all right? And maybe you won't either. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Mark's going to wrap up very briefly, and we're going to take questions. Mark?
I got one small.
Please, go ahead.
I want to add to what Harvey said at the beginning. I mean, I hate to bum you out even more, but the NEP, the National Election Poll, which does the exit polling, has recently announced that they're not going to have exit polls in 19 states. They canceled the exit polls in 19 states. They're not swing states. The argument is it's too expensive, they're not going to do it anymore. This is a disaster. This is yet another disaster as far as the possibility of a just electoral outcome next time is concerned. Basically, what we fear is the following. It's a reprise of something we've seen time and time again. It's a stunning upset victory. A stunning upset victory. I expect that we're going to see another stunning upset victory. Because they've already been laying the groundwork, doing a lot of what we call pre-propaganda, to justify this stunning upset victory by providing the press with a lot of very handy, albeit completely mistaken, explanations for what happened. One is, there's going to be another vast turnout of Christian voters. We've been hearing this lately. That's Ralph Reed's function, is to represent the Romney campaign's wizardry at getting the evangelical vote out, just like last time in 2004, although when you look at the evidence carefully, you see there was no vast turnout of Christian voters in 2004. That was a talking point by the Christian right. Pew did very careful polling and discovered that only 9% of those people who turned out to vote as values voters. The main issues were the economy and Iraq at that time. Okay? So there was no truth to this, and yet the press went ahead and ran with it anyway, and now it's common knowledge. Same with military voters. From what Jill says, we're going to hear that tons of troops turned out to express their greater confidence in Romney Ryan than in Obama. There will be all kinds of explanations such as these. However preposterous they may be, you have to understand that it no longer has to be terribly close, see, for the press to swallow it. And the most dramatic example of this that I can give you is what happened in the Democratic primary in South Carolina in 2010. It was won by a guy named Alvin Green, who had never campaigned. He had literally never campaigned. There wasn't so much as a lawn sign that this guy put up. Moreover, he was black in South Carolina and an accused sex offender, which shown his junk to a co-ed at the University of South Carolina in the library and got in trouble for it. This was the guy who beat the career politician and decorated National Guardsman who had campaigned for the Senate nomination for the Democratic Party, a guy named Vic Wall. He had campaigned. Somehow we're supposed to believe that Alvin Green, who did not campaign, won 59% of the vote, clearing the way for Jim DeMint, the Tea Party candidate, to win or win or win. Same as the similar doubts about John Kasich's victory as a Tea Party governor in Ohio, the same doubts obtained for Rick Scott, the Tea Party governor of Florida, the same doubts are in place for Scott Walker and for his Supreme Court chief in Wisconsin and for his recall victory. You know, there's abundant evidence in every case that these upsets have nothing to do with the will of the electorate. See? Now, I have thought all along, and I continue to think, that there is no substitute for public awareness of this problem. That's the great challenge here. As long as it's dismissed as a conspiracy theory and it doesn't get any coverage by the press, although election fraud in Iran and Mexico and Russia get plenty, right? People will not, they may distrust the results, as many do, but they'll think, well, it's just me. I think there's something wrong with it, but it's just me, okay? One thing I think we should come away with from this event is the imperative of getting hold of the latest Harper's, where there's an absolutely killer cover story by Victoria Collier, who's like the rest of us, been devoting her life to this cause. This is the best overview I've ever seen of the risk of election fraud, not voter disenfranchisement, you know, not the need for stricter controls on campaign contributions. No, election fraud. She talks about how the polling has been skewed. She talks about how exit poll results are always now adjusted to fit the official outcome, which is preposterous, and yet it's done time and time again. She talks about the dubious ownership of the voting machine companies. She talks about the red shift that takes place in election after election after election. The red shift means that there is a sudden, unaccountable divergence between the official outcome and the exit poll results, and it always benefits one party. Always, time and time again. This is statistically impossible. Couldn't happen on its own. This is a piece that you must get. Harper's and Rolling Stone have been the only major magazines in the United States to pay attention to this subject. So, you know, we definitely have to push for viable solutions, like Lori's. This is crucial. We have to come up with alternatives to the system that we have. It is essential that we get rid of computerized voting across the board and follow the leads of Ireland and the Netherlands and Germany, which did that. We have to forbid the participation of all private companies in the election process. This is not something that should be privatized, right? And then we should get rid of the Electoral College, and we should expand election day and have automatic registration. All these things have to happen. But first of all, we have to face the fact that we don't live in a democracy now, that our elections are a disgrace. And this is something that the press has to discuss and the Democratic Party has to face.
Let me second this real quickly, and then the Harper's article is extremely important, as Mark says. He's well quoted in there, and she uses a phrase in there called red shift. Now, in the election fraud that we've been seeing and documenting for the last 12 years, since 2000, the results that are dubious and clearly rigged have all gone in the direction of the Republican Party. And this is something that the Democratic Party refuses to face. Even the American left has refused to face the reality that our elections are being stolen and they're heading in one direction, which is to the right wing. And I want to give you an understanding of this. Bob Fitrakis and I, Bob is the attorney and I am a plaintiff in the King Lincoln's Bronzeville federal lawsuit. We won a federal lawsuit in Ohio in the wake of the 2004 election, requiring by federal law the preservation of all the election records in the 88 counties in Ohio in the wake of that election, so that we could actually do a recount and see what prove definitively what we were talking about. Because we watched at least 100 different methods that were used by the Republican Secretary of State in Ohio, J. Kenneth Blackwell, who was simultaneously serving as the co-chair of the campaign to re-elect Bush Cheney. The man in Ohio in 2004 who was in charge of the election was simultaneously in charge of re-electing George W. Bush. We won a federal lawsuit requiring the preservation of all the documents. We then had a Democratic Secretary of State who came in after Blackwell, Jennifer Brunner. She set aside an archive in Columbus to receive all these documents, and when she went to get them, she discovered that the documents documenting the 2004 presidential election in Ohio in 56 of the 88 counties had been destroyed, in direct contradiction of a federal injunction. This is the kind of situation that we are up against. Jesse Jackson has said it beautifully, twice, two quotes from Jesse Jackson. He said, we can afford to lose an election, but we can't afford to lose our democracy. And we cannot have public elections conducted on private voting machines. This is the death of our democracy. Bob Fitrakis and I are Greens. Bob is the Green Party candidate for Congress. I'm a Green Party supporter. We are not here stumping for Barack Obama. We are stumping here for small d democracy. We cannot afford to lose it.
Okay, right here in front.
Yes, hello, Judy Richheimer, thank you for doing this. Two questions. What do you think of New York's system, which has a paper ballot, which is read electronically? And Ms. Simpson mentioned that in terms of the data mining, we derive the time of day when a voter is voting. Now, I was stumping for Barack Obama this weekend, and we try to get commitment cards from voters, and part of what's on this card is what's your likely time of day of voting. Is there a possible nefarious outcome in that case of deriving this information? Should we not be doing this either?
To just answer your last question, and I'll defer to New York to the people more familiar, is in Ohio and in other states, and I saw this personally in 2004, it was the greatest mismatch in technology anywhere. I was an official election observer, and I've done that in El Salvador and elsewhere after the Civil War, is that the Republicans come in with handheld devices, etc. And at 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock, the name of everyone that has voted is posted in Ohio and many other states, which is part of the get out the vote. The Democrats came in with wet sheets. You couldn't read, right? And so the Republicans are sitting there going, inputting data directly to something at the time called the voter vault. What they announced in the Columbus Dispatch on the front page because they have a lot more money now, thanks to our election laws, is they're going to go all over the state of Ohio. Go to the 88 counties, go to the precincts, which are much fewer in rural area, and at 11 o'clock and at 3 o'clock, what they're going to do is input, which will give them a very precise count of every single person that's voted, and whether they're registered as a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. The Barack Obama campaign promised to put lawyers on the ground. Now, I worked with those lawyers on the ground. Not that I'm opposed to a good probate attorney from Connecticut, but when push came to shove, the probate attorney from Connecticut was not of much help. So my institution had prepared papers and affidavits ahead of time and went into court, and in 2004, 2008, done. But really, this high-tech choice point Melissa data, which is now wireless, is so far advanced. So what you're doing isn't wrong. That's absolutely what people should do. What they're going to do is have a very precise idea, which they didn't have in 2004, which led to 130% voter turnout in Sandusky, Ohio. 2 counties in Perry County, 124 and 121. 98.55% of the vote conquered Southeast, which we went there and proved that was fraud. They told us 679 out of 689 people voted. We said, fine, let's look at none provisionally, none absentee. We did a shocking thing. Got a public record. Look at who walked in the polls and signed in. 545 voters. Proving. There's a saying in Ohio, it's never over till the cyber vote comes in. Let me defer.
Now, as for New York, New York is the last state not to be in compliance with the Help America Vote Act.
Right.
The Help America Vote Act does not actually require states to use computerized voting, but it is interpreted to require it, okay? So the Department of Justice sued New York for clinging to its lever machines that people are very sentimental about. They have problems too, because a lot of those results are actually read by computers.
Yes.
That aside, we now have cut straight to the chase along with everybody else, and we feed our ballots into op scans. Understand, many people have thought in the past, the problem is only the DRE machines, the paperless voting machines. The problem is not the optical scanners, because there we have paper ballots. This is a fallacy, okay? It is just as easy to program op scans to misread ballots that are paper as it is to mess with a vote that's all electronic signal. Moreover, on the ground, in the real world, it is just about impossible to, you're not going to believe me when I say this, but in many states it is illegal to mount a hand count of paper ballots. It's illegal, you can't do it, you're not allowed. You have to feed them through another machine, okay? Well, it's the easiest thing in the world. It can take you under a minute to program op scans to be hypersensitive. There is evidence, for example, that LA County did not vote for Proposition 8, right? Because all day long, those op scans were spitting out all these ballots as undervotes. Okay, they were hypersensitive. They're saying, no, this isn't acceptable, this isn't acceptable. So the most gay-friendly county in California, we're supposed to think, passed this referendum. And then the whole gay activist community is immediately out there picketing churches. Okay, please, maybe you should just question whether Californians actually approve this. No, they had to go out and picket churches. Okay.
Can I just
Yeah.
add to that?
Let me just
Yeah, California.
conclude by saying that.
I funded the study.
Oh, okay. God bless you. The op scans are not any more reliable than the DREs. The last time I tried to vote here in New York, right, it spit out my vote. Then the guy who helped me vote read my ballot and gave me another one, and then that one was counted, but I have no idea how it was counted. I might as well have voted for, Romney, although it wasn't on the ballot.
So, I'll be very quick. The issue is, we want paper ballots, but the issue is our ability to access them, like Mark said. And Steve Freeman and we funded a study of the exit polls of Prop 8. Why did I know that? Because somehow I discovered that Mike Connell, the guy who died in the plane crash, the guy who was connected with Smart Tech, and Connell Donatelli, they were partners, was hired by the Mormon Church for $200,000 to work on Prop 8, okay? at Prop 8 was losing at 48 to 52 at 8:05 p.m. Prop 8 was winning, the one that denied gays the right to vote, at 52 to 48 at 12:33 p.m. Sorry, I'm sorry, my head, I'm getting overworked. Yes, to marry. And I want you to know that when we noticed differences in the exit polls that were 12 to 14% in select counties and also in San Francisco too, all right, as well as Glendale, Santa Monica, LA County differences. And 4 times we appealed to the Secretaries of State office to see if we could get some kind of recount or to look at the issue. And twice the appeals were not answered. That was Election Defense Alliance, was a different organization, and applied for that. One time they got a boilerplate from one of her under people, worked for her. And the last time I hired Cliff Arnebeck to write a letter, he's a lawyer, election lawyer from Ohio, to say we were going to subpoena the votes. And we got, unfortunately, a letter saying, differences between exit polls and vote totals do not necessarily indicate fraud. Please do not hesitate to consult with my fraud department if you get any additional information, which was the department we had consulted previously. So that is why we need to up-level, for the sake of our political officials, that it's wonderful to support election integrity and to really change how we view it, okay? Because having paper ballots is one part of the issue, but being able to get at them and have the support of our election officials is the other. Okay?
I've got one other thing to say. And before I say that, a lot of y'all may not know about Lori's history, but I do, having been a Republican operative. Lori's father was a guy who kept America safe. He is the guy who designed the radar system for the Patriot missile program. And now it's kind of interesting that his daughter is trying to help us, because the Patriot missile, if you know, knocked down the Scuds. And it's now kind of interesting that his daughter is trying to aid the United States government by protecting our elections. But with that said, here is the thing that I think is important of understanding. Carl is way ahead of the Democrats on technology. He picks out the very best people. Like I said, Mikey Cunningham was an example. Jeff Averbeck is another example. Hank Asher is another example. He picks out the smartest people who have government contracts. And in fact, it always seems to work to their advantage in that when they do these election services for him, soon after they get good contracts. And but what you got to understand is they're going to be, and that's the reason I'm holding my iPad, this year, the way we understand they're going to be operating, they're going to be like at Ohio with their iPad, and maybe the Democrats will have a piece of paper unless they go buy iPads after hearing this. And they're going to be typing in everybody who registers. So they will know who's voting. Now, what is significant about that is they're, signing in, because as y'all know, you sign in when you vote. And what's interesting about that, and what's so scary about that, is at 5 o'clock in the day, they will know everybody who's not voted, but who is registered. And so when they have access to central tabulators, like through the MOVE Act, because that act was written in a fashion in which there has been no certification or security put in to that guy I showed you that was Skittle, then they can say, well, in these states, this is who voted. And these are the people who are registered that didn't vote. And that's where those votes come into play. And that is a real concern. And so, do we really, as American citizens, want somebody there at the election site as we are signing up saying, at 3:30 in the afternoon, Jill Simpson was here? It's something really to think about. That's an individual selling it to a private data firm that can sell it to any place in the world? And do we really want people to know who votes and who doesn't? And I mean, obviously there's written reports, but it's entirely different when you think about the speed of the internet and the fact that in 2 hours they could figure out all the people, or an hour or 10 minutes, who did not vote, and those people could potentially vote.
Go ahead.
You've all given us amazing information, unsettling, and lots of goals to work for. But what's really pressing is, how are we going to save this election? What are we going to do? What can we do?
Well, the most obvious thing, which I'm attempting to do in Ohio with Harvey's help, and I really invite y'all in Ohio, we'll find, I have a very large house, and a carriage house I bought for this purpose. And actually, well, quite literally, people all over the country. The computers in Ohio will be monitored from Berkeley, California, by graduate students who told us in '08 when the computers went down. One of the only things we can possibly do, and I don't know if we're going to have enough volunteers in Ohio to do it, is we're going to attempt to do it randomly. We need to actually go to the polls at the end of the day and photograph. There's 880 precincts or so in Franklin County alone. Take actual pictures, and in certain areas actually count the people that are going in. So you have a hard count of who actually signed in. And at the end of the night, you've taken a picture of the actual vote total posted at the precinct level. It's the only possibility of catching a man in the middle attack. Very labor intensive. But that's one, and then we're going to feed them into a database. We already have it set up. And so we're going to actually get a tabulation of these posted results. The only problem in Franklin County is, shockingly, in one of our last elections, they programmed the computers wrong for the wrong day, so there was no printout at the precinct level for the second largest county in Ohio, where Columbus is. So we're hoping they've solved that problem, but some of us saw that as a test run. So that's one of the things we can do.
Let me say also real quickly, some of these laws, the Jim Crow laws, some of these laws have been overturned by the courts, but we expect that the Tea Party and other right-wing groups will be sending in people as poll workers, and they will be illegally but confronting voters who try to vote in swing states on photo ID and other requirements, just like they did in the South after the Civil War. We expect this in the swing states. So if you're looking for something to do, if you want to go to Pennsylvania or Virginia, closer to New York, or New Hampshire, go to the swing states and make sure that planted poll workers do not turn illegitimately.
Right. And they're not official poll workers. In Ohio, True the Vote is recommending groups of 5. And you really need to think about what Jesse Jackson has said. You're going to get 5 essentially white young Republicans in their 20s coming into my neighborhood on the Near East Side, an overwhelmingly black neighborhood, and challenging people they've never seen in their life. If people from my neighborhood, the majority blacks, went out to Upper Arlington where the rich live and began to challenge rich voters, how many SWAT teams would descend upon them? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, since this is so bleak, when I was working on this the first time in 2000, from Florida, I would say, I Googled the top 10 Democratic Party donors, people like Rob Reiner, people like that. And then I wrote all of them. It was 2000 when people sort of found election stealing kind of an odd idea. But 2 out of those 10 were going to come up with a fair amount of money, which what's her name in Illinois, I forgot her name, got.
Carol Mosman Brown.
What?
Carol Mosman Brown.
No, Jill something? I can't remember. Anyway, so now I would think most of those big donors would be very up for coming up with $50 or $100 million to basically protect their investment. If you had $50 or $100 million, what would you do with it?
Well, I would go to the swing states, which is Harvey and I point and Mark's point, right? I mean, the American elections, because of the Electoral College.
What specifically would you do?
I would go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, in Florida, first of all. And I mean, literally, and I would do this labor intensive. I would actually position people there. You could probably, pay them volunteers, 10, 15, but actually count the people that go into the polls and get the actual results and immediately put them into a database. But if you had that much money, what you could do in those key swing states is to do an actual randomized exit polls. The exit polls...
So have you presented this to these people?
We don't know those people, right? We're at a small institute, but if you want to give us their names, we'd be more than happy to present it. Go ahead.
Bob, additionally, I will say this, at all of the polls, if you see the person with the iPad there, you need to be trying to find out who they are.
Get a picture of their license plate.
And get a picture of their license plate or whatever you can do, because if they are sitting there, literally, they will pick, they will have a ground operation of people who know most of the people in the community for that box. And there are people in the communities, because we had them when I worked for the GOP, that would know everybody that was coming in to this particular box. So they literally could make their job very easy and say, sitting at the front door, Joe Jones just walked in and went to the machine. And they can click it. Literally, in the urban areas, they will have the same, because they'll have people who are community organizers for that community. There might be some urban areas that they do not, but any area, and that would be a good thing to do, is get out, is anybody who sees people with iPads registering the names of the vote, get every piece of information about them you can.
Go ahead.
A question is basically two sides of the Atlantic. One is, do you have an idea of who these Spanish operatives are? And my concern is, are they the same people who are destroying the 2/3 of a century effort to create a stable, just, peaceful, democratic peninsula called Europe? And then on this side, do we have a problem with the continuance of the New York Times, which has the ability to anesthetize everyone, and the broader spectrum of being the media capital of the world? Two guys control it. One name is Murdoch, the other one is Bloomberg. So they sort of put a kibosh on everything. And then the last thing, it's my perspective, and you may think I'm out to lunch, but in 3 months we will have the 80th anniversary of the demented Paul von Hindenburg's handing over the keys to Germany. And my sense is that the folks who have acquired the legal vessel of the Republican Party are tracking those folks exactly.
Go ahead. Jim, go ahead.
Real quick.
Mark.
As best we can tell right now, without actually having gone to Spain and turned Skittle upside down, but Skittle, as I derisively call them, is essentially owned by a coalition of the big European banks. And not just Spanish banks, but European banks in general. And those are the guys who are really threatening to set the world on fire by their mismanagement of loans all across Europe. There's a definite correlation between the banking crisis today and our being ripped off financially and having our elections stolen. They're happening at the same time, and that's not a coincidence.
Yeah, actually, the Free Press, there was a right-wing story in Jill saying that George Soros owned Silent. So we actually looked into it, got financial records. The only company we could find with a direct investment was the Carlyle Group. That's on the Free Press. You can actually look at. I don't know the other banks. Go ahead.
Okay. It was kind of interesting that he said that about George Soros, because based on our investigation that we've done and all our traveling, what we found is that Bob Fitrakis, as I pointed out, is tied to almost every organization there is. He was a president at Seidel. He was at Premier as late as November of this past year. When we went to the Premier office in Dallas, Texas, they said, oh no, Bob's moved to ES&S now. And if you start looking, every one of them are tied or have deals with each other. Like Melissa Data has ties with SmartTech. SOE is tied to SITL, which means SOE, is tied to Bob Urosevich because he was president of SITL. And what is really bonkers about the basic thing is Bob Urosevich is basically what I call a walking antitrust violation, because he is going to every single election facility in the country and working cooperatively. And you will find like ES&S cooperates with Dominion. But basically, I want you to get this in your mind, because this is really the important thing when you think about it. About 40% of the vote is covered roughly by 40 to 45% is by Dominion. Bob does work with Skittle, and he does work with Premier that does work with Dominion. And Dominion is ran by a guy in Canada named John Paulus, which is who they refused to let us know about. Then SITL is ran by a guy in Spain. But Bob Urosevich, that guy, he's everywhere. And he actually, when the Department of Justice looked at this a couple of years ago, when ES&S filed, was attempting to buy Premier and Dabo, I think it was. And they said, you can't, they had bought it, and they said, you have to be divested of it because you have 70% of the vote. So Bob Urosevich's answer to this was, I'll just float amongst these companies, and this will solve it, and we will technically divide it, but we will run both of those out of Toronto, both ES&S and also. So Toronto is one of the places we're going next, and Dominion. But the reality is this, is about 85 to 90% of their vote is by corporations that are overseas. And then I did not focus on the hard inner civic story because Bob Fitrakis and them were doing that and spending a full amount of time on tying Romney to it. So I didn't devote it to it, but I do want to say this about hard inner civic. When I was helping Carl over the years, Hard Inner Civic was owned by George Bush supporter, the bulk of it, whose name was Tom Hicks, which actually happens to be my grandfather's name, which is why I always remember it. And Tom Hicks is famous for buying George W. Bush out from the Rangers. And so basically, this transfer from the Bushes to Romney is a natural progression. But if you start looking at this whole situation, we basically have one guy bouncing around to almost every company. And they're being operated outside of the United States. And what I hope to see is that our government takes over the elections and kicks out the privateers. We're a great country. Why should we have private corporations handling our elections?
And Bob, early on, the early reports were that a lot of the software was first thought of by a group called the CIA. And this had come out during the 70s, during the famed Church Committee and others that talked about benign operations. Those of you who remember your history, there were these bloody, vicious coups, the most famous in Indonesia, where 800,000 ethnic Chinese died. And benign operations, Duarte in El Salvador, where I went after the election, was you rigged the election so you didn't have to kill anybody, right? It was a benign, friendly operation. And you may, if you ever look at some old, somebody attempted to do this to keep Marcos in power in the Philippines. And Richard Lugar, who was there, refused to go along with it, who was kind of driven out by the Tea Party. But, and they did it on mainframes. And Urosevich was tied to some of the early development of software. But you can actually see this on old videos. In the middle of the race between Aquino in the 80s and Marcos, they stopped the computer vote count, brought in new tapes, and then the results reversed itself.
But do you think that the Times, as a hallmark of journalism, suppresses all this information? I mean, because they let a group of major media in 2000 to do a recount in Palm Beach County, and they found that Gore took it, which meant he took the Electoral College, and yet they buried the story for quote-unquote the good of the country.
Let me just take it over, because this is a very important thing you're bringing up. The consortium that counted all the votes in Florida, and I'm sure some of you don't know this because most people don't. The consortium, the media consortium that counted all the votes in Florida from the 2000 election under the auspices of the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, did find that Al Gore won the election. He won the election. How many of you knew that? Okay. He won. As you say, the New York Times and all the other major media, okay, including those who were part of the consortium that counted votes, spun the story opposite. They all reported that the recount showed that Bush won. You may remember this. This was 2 months after 9/11. Now, Bush did win if they had only counted the votes in the 3 counties in South Florida. Remember, Gore had said stupidly, I will accept either a recount in those 3 counties or a full state recount, because his staff was divided, so he gave this ridiculous pair of offers, and of course nobody heard him say the whole state. They only heard him say the 3 counties, and then they accused him of cherry picking, right? Only if they had counted only the votes in those 3 counties would Bush have won. But you don't count the votes only in some counties, you count the votes in all the states, right, counties. Nevertheless, that's the way the press covered it. And Len Downey of the Washington Post is reported to have said about this, well, we're at war, and he's our commander-in-chief. So it was actually a sort of patriotic duty to misrepresent what had actually happened, you know, and that explains
But they
that.
committed sedition.
Yeah, it's called dictatorship.
Well, yeah, sure. What are you going to do about it, right? You're absolutely
But
right. The New York Times has an absolutely dreadful record on this whole issue.
Yeah.
Dreadful. They never cover this issue except now and then to ridicule people who are interested in it. I think they did give you guys a fair shake once. They once did a story about their efforts to get the votes protected in Ohio, and it was remarkably fair. And it wasn't derisive at all. But ordinarily, you know, they don't cover it, but cover it only to make fun of it. They devote far more attention to video games than they do to election technology and so on, okay? And I have more stories I can tell you. Suffice it to say that the Times, like all the other major media, will not go there, and I think it's a matter of tacit policy. They will not go there. They just won't. Now, I think they could conceivably be shamed into going there, depending on what happens on November 6th. You know, if the outcome is so egregious that enough people are so upset that they will not let it go for once, you know, it's possible that if they were, my view is, I'm a little hot-headed, my view is that people should be directing their protests at the median. You know, there should be 1,000 people jamming the doorway of the New York Times building and insisting that they pay attention to this stuff, because the media is the problem here, right? That should be the focus of people's protests over the way this whole thing is covered, right? And people should also consider, this is my idea and I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it at all, okay? The people should be bringing crowbars to the polls, okay? Because I don't recommend that. They should bring, because the time has come to Jim crowbars. You know, these machines are an impediment to democracy. They are a means of subverting democracy. We need hand-counted paper ballots. I don't recommend that, though.
And I do actually. I will recommend that. Jim crowbars should go to the voting machines need to be destroyed. These voting machines are subverting our democracy. I'm going to say a couple things real quickly. First of all, Bob Fitrakis and I wrote major stories over the course of many years of what happened in Ohio in 2004. There has never been a major media organization, corporate media organization, come into Ohio and do a definitive check on whether what we said was true. Our stuff is
progressive media.
Oh, progressive media, that's right. We were attacked. When Bob and I broke the major stories out of Ohio, we were attacked by Mother Jones, The Nation, and The Village Voice, and other left-wing publications. No major corporate or left-wing organization has come in a systematic way since 2004, or the Democratic Party.
Craig Unger in the back of the room, his book, Boss Road, He actually went and got the records, and we were called crazy when we said the vote went down to Chattanooga. So if you want to read one book that actually looked at the facts, Mr. Unger's back.
We are still, Dan Rather did come into Ohio and do a part of the story about some of the shenanigans in Northern Ohio, but not the Democratic Party either. The Democratic Party has been exceedingly hostile to any of our systematic findings.
Publicly
about
while
Ohio.
privately leaking like a sieve. Most of the information we gathered came from the Democratic Party at the highest level, who then would show up on TV and say we were crazy.
That's correct.
After they gave us the data on the missing machines.
Now, the pattern we're seeing, and you can watch for it on election night, is that the vote count will come in, and it'll be in the key states, and you'll get certain results. And I believe it may well show that Obama has won the election, more or less, and then you will start to see around midnight, deep in the deep night, 11 o'clock, after 11 p.m. and up to about 3 a.m. in the morning, you will hear about glitches in the vote count. And this is what happened in Ohio. At 12:20 at night, a screen was shown on CNN that showed that John Kerry had very substantially won the election, and especially in 9 of the 11 swing states. And by 2 a.m., and then there were all sorts of problems with the vote count, or the electronic tallying. And by 2 in the morning, 4 of the swing states, Iowa, New Mexico, Nevada, and most importantly, Ohio, had done the red shift. We call them now the purple states. They were blue at midnight, and they were red at 2 in the morning. And to this day, nobody from the Democratic Party, not John Kerry, not Al Gore, has challenged or has done a definitive study of what has gone on and what went on in 2000, or especially 2004.
Get that $7 million back.
John Kerry had a fund, a $7 million fund that was specifically earmarked to have legal teams make sure that the election in 2004 was stolen. And the only money that we know was spent was to hire the Republican law firm, the Taft law firm in Cincinnati, to put a lawyer out, an attorney named Hoffheimer, to attack Bob and I for breaking these stories. So what Mark has said, this is, as a historian, it is staggering that there has been no historians either have come in and done, that I know of, have done major studies, ground level studies to see what happened in Ohio 2004. It's a staggering story. We hear about Chicago in 1960. I will tell you very briefly, Chicago in 1960, Illinois was definitely stolen, or as they say, bought for John Kennedy, but it did not decide the election. John Kennedy could have lost Illinois in 1960 and still won the presidency. That's why Richard Nixon did not challenge. The Republican storyline is Richard Nixon didn't challenge the theft of Illinois in 1960 because he was too great a patriot and he did not want to upset the American democracy. In fact, Richard Nixon could have won Illinois in 1960 and he still would not have won the presidency. The Electoral College was still not sufficiently close. Illinois had 27 votes. If you had flipped them to Nixon, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. That was not the case in Ohio 2004. And yet no one has come forward from the major media or the Democratic Party. And this is the real danger we face in 2012. We think there's a high likelihood that of these 9 states with Republican governors and secretaries of state, there's ample funding and ample technology to flip the key states as needed. And we think it is very high likelihood it will happen. And this will be devastating to our democracy. It will be the third of the last 4 presidential elections stolen. And we have to make sure this doesn't happen.
Joe.
Can I add?
Yeah, I'll get that.
I want-
All right, Joe.
Or do you?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I've been wanting to talk for a while, but I value tremendously what everyone else is saying. I remember some people like yourself saying, well, what can I do? You're in supposedly a non-swing state. I do support going to swing states if you can, but if you can't, I want you to know that Rove discussed with Kruger a long time ago that his desire, if Romney might not win, which for a while he thought he wasn't going to, was to have a fully Republican Senate and Congress, okay? And for example, one person who he's got a real target on her back is Elizabeth Warren, all right? And there are some campaign managers who are actually aware of stuff like this, but definitely feel also hampered by some of the laws about not being able to touch the ballot. So, you know, I've been working with some of them, but I wanted to say for those of you who would like something, if you write down the website, democracyandelectionintegrity.org, we're going to have some guidelines for you guys who may not be able to go to a swing state to video the vote in ways that Bob and Harvey have recommended, and also to learn to be a poll observer and to understand the process of that. To also, you'll see on that same website the stuff about the Trachtenberg system, which you might want to promote to help clean up the chaos, if there is chaos afterwards. And the fourth thing, and I feel less hopeful about this, having heard you, Harvey, is Bob and I were hoping that somehow the Obama campaign would get upset that Romney owns a major voting machine company, and $10 million worth, by the way. It's no sneeze of stocks, you know, and reported to the FBI also to watch things. So I don't know how far up any of you are in any campaign, but those were the ways. And just to finally quote, that Stalin gave a quote that it didn't matter what the people vote for, it's he who counts the votes that is important. So, you know, it's up to you guys. You're right here in New York. You know, you want an honest election. You want your votes you can trust. These are some of the ways, okay? And then if you can go to a swing state, go to it.
One other important thing to remember is that Carl has, over the years, basically used the court system to win as well. And that's kind of where my start was, in that I learned how to research judges. And I researched all the 11th Circuit judges for him. And then also, when I came forward in the Siegelman case, I provided the same choice point documents to the Siegelman lawyer team that I had provided for Carl. I'd gotten a friend of mine to get signed up for choice point so that I could use the same thing that they were using at Smart Tech at that time. And Carl it is very possible in this election that the election will not be won at the polls, but will be won in the courts. And we started seeing him in Alabama, and I was involved in it with Perry Hooper's campaign, where he spends a great deal of time researching the judges. So it's important to understand that data mining is not only used for the voters, but it's also used to research the very judges that will judge these cases. And he will have a fast file on every single judge that is making the decisions. So if it ends up filed in the courts, citizens, researchers can assist in helping research the judges and turning in information about them that he may have as access, because there may be people out there who know. We kind of expect that not only will it not be won at the polls, but possibly in the courts. So for that, that's something to start thinking about. And the minute, if the polls get flipped at the night, is to start thinking about which judges will Carl be looking at, and what is his connection to those judges as far as way of appointment, since they're normally going to be federal judges that's going to decide those cases since it's states. And like I said, my job that I did for the most part was researching judges. That's one of my specialties.
Any, right there.
So, my name is Eric Lazarus, and I'm the author of The Machinery of Democracy, Protecting Elections in an Electronic World. One question I wanted to ask is, I come from the belief, after studying this for several years, that no matter, this technology is so insecure that even if I owned an election system vendor, someone could still get in and steal the election underneath me. It's that bad. I couldn't even, this stuff is so insecure that even if you bought an election system vendor, you could still have the election restolen underneath you. It's that bad.
What should be doing that?
Don't poke me on that idea. source voting system. That, that unless we invent something really clever, fundamentally different, they could also be subverted. So it's only due to procedures and audits that we will ever have an election system, at least in the foreseeable future, that could be trustworthy. So as much as having a national voting system based on open source software, would be good for a lot of reasons, it still doesn't give you a trustworthy election. Does anyone disagree with that idea? I mean, so it's the need of, we ought to have open source national voting technology A. B, we should have awesome audits, because it's only with the audits that you can have that this stuff can actually be trustworthy. Is that right?
Yes, I'm waiting for Saturday Night Live to do a sketch. You can drive by an electronic polling place and with Wi-Fi switch the vote in some circumstances. This is possible to do. So I'm waiting for Saturday Night Live to have like Democrats, Republicans, Greens, Carl, all these cars driving by and the vote goes to Social Network. That would be a great sketch for Saturday Night Live. That's how bad it is, but it could happen. You're right, it could be going.
I want to make a prediction. If we survive as a democracy, or if we resume, we're going to go to hand-counted paper ballots. It's going to happen. There is no other. I mean, of course, you can steal elections that way too, but nowhere near as slyly, right, and not on the same scale as you can with an electronic system. Like one guy can change the vote totals for a whole state, and it's imperceptible.
Which was the Everett study in Ohio.
Right.
I mean, the Secretary of State, Jennifer Bruner, issued a long report, brought everyone in, academics, etc., and said a simple handheld device in a battleground state like Ohio could actually change the election.
Right. And let me be the first to advocate that when we use hand-counted paper ballots, that they be done on recycled hemp paper, as was the Declaration of Independence.
Lori quoted the Stalin statement, and I really think that Bob Yerosevich's statement to reply to that ought to be that my philosophy is not that if you count the vote, it is if you own the machine that counts the vote.
Yeah, I think you're too.
And because, you can change the vote any which way you want if you own the machine. And that guy is at almost every country in the nation.
Jim, and then we'll get back to your follow-up, and then we're going to stop because we're going to go do a 2-hour radio show. Go ahead.
If I was to make one brief point here on how to fix it, there needs to be strategic lawsuits, but those lawsuits have to be directed at establishing fundamental civil rights. We have to have a civil right to genuinely fair elections and a civil right to do oversight. Right now, the whole right to oversight is drastically limited by electronic voting, but we also have some states where the right to oversight is connected to the right of the people. Some states it's the right of the candidate. Some states it's the right of the parties. So it has to be a right of the people. And it has to be a right that can be held by non-technical people. And that excludes various cryptographic fixes and things of that nature. If we don't start from a standpoint of basic civil rights, look, I'm also a member of the board of directors, Southern Arizona chapter, ACLU. So since first this year. So I've had to think, I'm not here representing ACLU, but I have to think there about basic civil rights. And that conversation has not come up near enough in the area of electronic voting, of voting in general regardless. We've got to go back to basics.
Last follow-up.
So if people were voting on hand-counted paper ballots, would they favor to basically way scale down the size of ballots? Because in Spain, for example, they do this really well, but you only have 2 votes on each ballot. So I don't know much about the way hand-counted paper works, I guess in New Hampshire and stuff.
I was the international observer. I co-wrote the report after the Civil War in El Salvador and edited it and delivered it to the United Nations. The precincts there in Suchitoto, which was ground zero between the death squads and the guerrilla, which I was sent into, thousands, 3,000 people, a variety of parties, a lot of different candidates. We counted them. It took, shockingly, about 6 hours. The parties were there, the press were there, the public was there, and they quite literally, it doesn't take, there's this amazing thing. They put up this big, huge sheet of canvas, and they, when they agreed, they simply marked on it, made a 5, and lo and behold, you know, in the US they'll say, oh my God, the precincts are too large in the urban areas. They're really not. You're talking, you know, 1,000, 1,500 people. It's not that hard to get the preliminary count if you have enough people there. I mean, that's part of the mythology, is you could never do that because you're doing it in a decentralized nature. And you can actually further decentralize the precincts to a neighborhood level. And it's really not that hard to do. And it's full transparency. And quite frankly, that's the only thing that kept the Mano Blanca and the death squads from killing the guerrillas at the poll, is they all agreed it was an absolutely fair vote count.
Bob,
We have time for one. We have time for one.
one other little statement. Also, so you know, other countries who have been voting with these machines have now come along and said, these are junk. And one of the countries, I think, is Ireland. I think that's in, and they have thrown away the machines. So hopefully we're going to see all across the world, because these same companies, American companies or foreign companies that have bought out American companies now at this point, they have now been recognized in other countries that are using them as just being boxes that aren't worth a piece of it. So they've thrown them away.
Yeah, and we just opened up a casino in Ohio, in Columbus, Toledo. In those casinos, they have roving gangs that routinely come in, grab machines, seize them, pour over forensic computer experts to make sure they're fair. They have to be sealed by the auditor. The voting machines, they put it out for a month at a born-again church, and lo and behold, 638 people voted, and Bush gets, 3,700 votes. I mean, it was like a miracle of epic proportion. We call it the Loaves and Fish poll. I mean, it sat out hackable with jacks in the back for a month. But if that was a casino, they have these squads. So, I mean, and the gas pumps have to be sealed by an auditor, randomly checked, but not voting machines. And I'll leave you on that note. We're going to stick around.
We have one more question we have to close. I'm going to be, just for the record, at 3 o'clock, we have to rush uptown. We're going to be on the Progressive Radio Network. If anyone, we're going to have a special 2-hour show on this. The number is 888-874-4888 if you want to call in. 888-874-4888. It's the Progressive Radio Network, prn.fm. So if we can have a good closing, one more question in closing, then we'll rush up.
In terms of you getting thousands of people to Ohio, are you trying to work with Move On? And by the way, they would know how to reach those 10 millionaires that would give you 50 million. They have their contacts.
I'm not.
Can I talk a little bit about this, the money? I mean, I don't want to rain on anybody's parade, but I don't want to rain on anybody's parade, and I think we should all be trying to get money from rich people to, right? But the fact is that if the party won't acknowledge the issue, these millionaires who give to the party won't see why they should have to.
Rob Reiner understands. I've talked.
Well, so
If you have his number, we'll call him.
yes.
Tell him to call us. We started a new committee.
No, seriously, if he's serious, if he'll give us money, we'll approach him.
Castle Rock Entertainment.
But,
Find
well, yeah, I think coming over the transit isn't too helpful.
Getty Area LH, she gave us a bunch of money.
Who?
I forgot her name. Lori
Who's us? Who gave who a lot of money?
Remember when I was helping you guys years ago?
Yeah.
And then before you guys, it was 2000, doing the same thing.
Well, at any rate, Larry David was very concerned about this before the 2008 election.
So please remember the website's freepress.org and
freepress.org. We've got about 4 or 5 new articles out. Also, if you're going to write about it, the press, there's books in the back published by our institute, which is just worth it for the footnotes. Hundreds and hundreds of footnotes of computer glitches. You're welcome to it in the back of the room. Thank you.
And if you want to also support democracy and election integrity,
You can.